Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I know there are many other events on this area campus at the same time, so I really appreciate that you have chosen to come to this talk, and I assure you that you will not be disappointed. I really, first of all, need to acknowledge the support from the various units on this campus. The Department of History, American Studies Program, Society for the Humanities, Latin American Studies Program, and the Institute of African Development. And I'm also deeply grateful for Professor Russell for his support. Russell actually contacted several of the units. Without Russell's support, this talk would not have been possible. I also want to acknowledge the support of Ms. Donna particularly for the technical and organizational assistance. So now I'm actually very honored to introduce to you Professor Jesse Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin is an interdisciplinary world systems sociologist and anthropologist with interests in theory, critical race theory, epistemology, coloniality, decolonial and development theories, and Pan-African theory and culture. Since 1987, he has conducted fieldwork and research on forced Bedouin resettlement in Israel and Egypt, identity and historiography on the Swahili coast of Kenya, and anti-racist theory and practice in North America. He also serves on the Walter Rodney Foundation Board as editor and peer-reviewed editor of peer-reviewed journals of Zanj and Intersectionality, and to administer the Walter Rodney Speaker Series in Atlanta. In particular, he recently edited with Robin E.G. Kelly, Walter Rodney's The Russian Revolution, which is a very good book. And he also brought another book by Walter Rodney, Groundings with My Brother, and the books are available for sale. And also have swags from the Walter Rodney Foundation, also available for sale. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jesse Benjamin.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for having me. It means a lot to be here today. Can you all hear me okay? Am I projecting enough? Good, it's a nice space. I have a lot of history in upstate New York, as Dr. Bush Davies knows, and actually on this campus as well, so it's really nice to be in this space in particular with the history that I have and also that we all are researching in this work. I want to share sort of informally today some of the work I've been doing. I see a lot of familiar faces, which is really cool. I just want to go through a bunch of it, show you some slides. I'm focusing on stuff you might not have seen, so I'm going to skip over things that you may know better in Walter Rodney's history. And I want to cover a lot of ground and then, fill in gaps with the Q&A. So I think, is it safe to assume everybody here knows who Walter Rodney is already? In some audiences, I start with a detailed introduction of who Walter Rodney was. One of the questions I guess I pose to all of us, and along the way I want to note that I think there's room for many PhD dissertations in this area, and I'm going to highlight a bunch of those. But one of the questions is, we know who Walter Rodney is, but in a way I think we really need to continue determining who he is and where he fits, because the way the academy and the way society has located him is usually very reductive and marginalized, and I think he deserves to be much more central in a lot of things. So, Marxist, a historian, an activist, a Pan-Africanist. He's Guyanese, he's Caribbean. I also point out that he's a South American, which usually gets left out. There are a lot of different things. Is he a decolonial thinker? I don't think he would have called himself a post-colonial thinker. He would have called himself a neo-colonial, anti-neo-colonial thinker. So how he would have thought about decolonial theory is actually a very fascinating thing for me to think about. So the first thing I wanted to show you, I'm coming from Atlanta, and it seemed relevant. The slides are all slightly to the right. I'm directionally dyslexic. I wish they were slightly to the left, but anyway, so they're slightly cut off, but that's fine. You'll get to see them. So I've been in Atlanta for 12 years. I ended up there after a couple of stops after being in Binghamton, which I'll come back to. So this is what's fresh on our mind. The date is cut off, the 322 to 323. That's Walter Rodney's birthday, and every year, rather than on his assassination date, on his birthday, his family, who are based in Atlanta, have convened a whole series of things. But first it started with depositing his papers at the AUC Woodruff Library, the library that's shared by Morehouse, Clark, Spelman, ITC, and formerly, and maybe in the future, Morris Brown. So those papers are down there, and that's an important thing for researchers to know about. They're a great resource. Every year after they got founded, this is after they got put there, this is the 16th annual Walter Rodney Symposium. I'm the co-chair with Asha Rodney, and we run this every year, and it continues to grow in size. And so this is very much fresh on my mind. I was just going to show you what we were thinking about. This is Asha Rodney introducing the conference. And these are some of the keynote speakers, and we get to know some of these folks, but that's Dr. Patricia Rodney, who's Walter Rodney's wife. Next to her is our keynote speaker, Marie Fanon Mendez, France, who was with us for those few days. Marcelo Brodsky came to talk about 1968, and he's an artist, so he represented photos of the global revolution of '68, which was our theme last year and this year, given the anniversaries that you all are going through, and that everybody in Black Studies is with '68 and '69. Then we have Kenini Rodney. Keith Waite is he's a Guyanese flautist. I did give him your regards, and he was amazing. So he sort of channeled some ancestral sounds and played throughout the weekend. And then Asha again, Abiel Lasau, and me. Kenini was inspired and wrote a poem and shared that with us, and he improvised. So that was an unexpected freestyle session that we had. So Walter and Pat had 3 children, Asha, Kenini, and Shaka. Shaka doesn't come as often because he's based in the Caribbean. Asha's based in Atlanta, and Kenini's nearby in Alabama, so can drive in and participate directly. It was officially declared in the state of Georgia Walter Rodney Day. This is Abel Mabel Thomas, who is the one and only really down representative in our neighborhood. So she fights for us, and that's Pat. And that's actually Kai, the grandson, and he read the proclamation. He's old enough to do that now, so they get involved in the program as well, the kids. This is at UC Quayana. I wanted to note his attendance. At this stage, he's living with his son also in Atlanta, so Atlanta ends up being an unexpected hub where a lot of people that I didn't expect to be there are there. In this audience, many of you know, but at UC Quayana was one of the first socialist elected officials in the history of the Caribbean, all the way back to the 50s, was a mentor to Walter Rodney, and then called Walter Rodney his mentor. And in his mid or upper 90s now, he comes and contributes and has interventions and is very active in what we do. This was our book launch panel. On the far end is Ward Churchill, another person I did not expect to find in Atlanta. I was very excited to connect with and around with. David Austin was our plenary lecturer, and he had 2 books out that intersected with the work we're doing. One was on the 1968 Congress of Black Writers that Walter Rodney was at, and where I think he became world known, along with Stokely and others, and that's where he was when Jamaica banned him. And then Pat and Asha and me, but we have Joff Frank there as well. Joff Frank was one of 2 people we've met in the last 2 years, who, when we talked about Walter Rodney in Jamaica in 1968, grounding with his brothers and his sisters, and we'll talk about that in a minute, this was one of the people who was the young teenagers who was leading him in those groundings. And so we started to get those perspectives in the book, which I'm so excited to have and share. By the way, you're the first people after me to see this publicly, I think. I picked them up in Brooklyn a few days ago. I've been putting them on social media, but we finally have a copy of the book. And in the book, Bongo Jerry, who was 2 years older than Joff Frank, and they came together last year, gives us a first-hand account of what it was like to have Walter there, just for 9 months. It was only 9 months that he was there, grounding with his brothers. And so their perspective on that is really invaluable and really cool to have. And this is afterwards with all the organizers, including a lot of student volunteers and stuff at the Sunset. So, briefly, my own history with Walter Rodney started when I was a student in London. And I was at the Overseas Development Institute's library, and I got to work there and check out books. That was really nice. And I would ask sort of people reading radical books for advice on other books. And Walter Rodney's name kept coming up, and I got to know an Eritrean scholar there, and he put me on to How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and I read it. I was in a Quaker school at the time that had international centers all over the world, and reading that book had a big part in why I decided to go to our Kenya center after the London center. And so I did read the book in London, but it really impacted me differently when I got to the coast of Kenya and I was living in a squatter village and I was studying the history from slavery to the squatter situation I was in and to the modern era. And it was one of about 5 or 6 books when I read it there, it explained everything I was seeing. Land ownership, production, history, the problems with historiography that we're seeing, issues of decolonization that were still going on. And that's when that book became very, very real to me. And I sort of continued to read after that everything by Rodney I could get my hands on. And he's joined that small list of people like that for me. You know, there's a number of scholars. Once you read them, you have to read all their stuff. The other thing about his book was I would read it wherever I went. It's a pretty thick book and it takes time to go through it in detail. And so I would have it with me in the market or on a matatu, little buses that you drive in. And it was one of those rare books where people would come up to me and say, oh, that book is awesome, or I knew Walter Rodney, or I was there in Makerere when he debated Ali Mazrui. So that was the beginning of seeing that this guy didn't just write books, but he impacted people on a very interesting level. And then personally for me, after all of that, I wrote an ethnography in that community that got above 500 pages. I actually finished it in upstate New York at my grandparents' house, drove up to Cornell, and got it bound like a dissertation because it was too thick for a normal book. And so that was one of my trips to Cornell. And it was only $10 to bind it with a nice black cover. It was a long time ago, 92. Anyway, then later I'm in grad school in Binghamton, and I was teaching my first actual full-on class. I had done some TA. And my class was Africa and the World System in the sociology program. So I was very excited to teach that. And I was using How Europe. And we were going to have our first reading of How Europe Undeveloped Africa. And I was also part of some social movements. And my friends and I had just taken over a building around the diversity struggle that we had. And so I was teaching my class in the lobby of the building we had taken over. And we were sitting in a circle, and I learned that in various Marxist study groups, sit in a circle and read collectively paragraph by paragraph and discuss as you go. And we were reading How Europe, and in the introduction, it describes how, as many of you know, when he got back to Guyana in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, he wasn't allowed to take up his job as a professor, and so he had to travel to make money. And I'd read this before, but it didn't click, and this is when it clicked for me. It says he went to Binghamton and Cornell and Michigan, and so I was just really kind of blown away. Here's this incredible person who came to Binghamton, and there was no, I'd been to Binghamton now for 2 or 3 years, and there was no memory of him that was physical. So we started a Rodney study group, and we came up with ideas. Let's keep reading, let's expand the knowledge of, our knowledge of the literature, and then we started talking about maybe let's name the student, we want to name the student union after him. We later found out you have to have $1 million donation to do that, so we're still waiting on a big donor to do that. I still think we should do it, by the way, but we raised some money for a scholarship. We actually got a couple $1,000 and had to donate that into the system. And our big accomplishment was the Walter Rodney conference that we pulled off in 1998. It was the first major international conference on Walter Rodney since the year after he died. There was a conference at UCLA with Ed Alpers. And so I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So just to go back to Walter Rodney's life, I have a couple slides. This is the part I think that is well known about Walter Rodney. This is a cool picture of him that not everybody's seen from when he was at Queens College. And I also pulled this out because I'm going to be speaking at Queens College in York in New York in a couple days. I want to show them the other Queens. Queens College is wherever British colonialism went. So this is him as a young college kid. And then we get to, I'm going to fast forward because we know he went to, after he graduates and he gets his PhD at 26 at school, SOAS in London, he goes for a year and a bit to Tanzania, then does his thing in Jamaica. He doesn't get to finish his year out, and so he's forced out of the country, briefly stays in Cuba, which we're actively researching because there's some tantalizing details there that we've got our hands on, and we're looking for a lost precursor to How Europe that he was writing while he was there at the behest of the government. But it's been lost, so we're looking for that. Then he goes to Jamaica. After Jamaica and Cuba, then he goes back to Tanzania. It has a very important period there. I noticed Seth Markle's coming in a little while, so you're going to get to hear, he's not focusing on that, but his new book, Motorcycle on Hell Run, is a very good entry point into that. And there's other people who have done work on the Tanzania years, which are a very important subject in their own right. And as a fellow East Africanist, my work is in Kenya, I'm very fascinated by that period, but we're going to skip over that. Then he decides it's time for me to go back. He didn't get kicked out of Tanzania, but he left before things got too hot because he was a critic of the government, and the government didn't like critics of the government, even though they were open to criticism, there was limits. And so he comes back to Guyana, and this is the kind of thing he's doing. This is his groundings, and this is bauxite workers coming out at the end of the day. And the WPA, the Working People's Alliance, that he was a founding, leading member of, would go and meet people where they were and do street education like that. So I wanted to show you that photo in particular. There's others like it. So during those years is when he was coming to Binghamton for a 6-week half semester that the sociology department has set up. And we had people like Annabelle Quijano as well, and others who would come through on these half semesters, Catherine Cochran-Vidrovich and others that I got to work with when I was in Binghamton. And so that was beginning to trace what was his impact in Binghamton. This is him during one of those visits where he could go on the weekend to the Schomburg, and he could go up to, he used to also go to the IBW and do summer institutes there, the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta. We've done a lot of work excavating that history, which is very important. Derek White's new book on that, and a couple of other pieces of scholarship I think are bringing that back for us. So at the Rise of Black Studies, you have these various institutions, Binghamton, Cornell, Amherst, Michigan, Wayne State, and other schools on the West Coast that he visited. And he was showing up at all these schools, contributing, doing research, residencies, and then at the Institute of Black World also being a part of the summer classes that were happening. So I hoped before I got here I'd actually find in the archives a treasure trove of Cornell-related stuff to share with you, and I did not, but I'm going to dig deeper. But also I put out the call to you all in your archives here, and we'll do the same in Atlanta. Maybe we can find more of that material and bring it back. I think it's an important job. So rather than just tell you I failed to do it, I'm going to keep working on it, but maybe we can collectively see if that's possible. So these are some cool pictures we pulled out of, there's not a lot of photos of him on the internet. There's a small set of photos that recirculate, and we're starting now to find more photos and get them into circulation. Part of my task, I didn't plan it this way, but I've ended up working with the foundation and with the family, and I'm quite frankly amazed that there aren't a whole bunch of other people kind of elbow me out of the way and do that work. I find myself one of the only people really consistently doing that work in Atlanta, and I invite you all in various ways to join. But part of the calling then is this is one of a handful of people, several handfuls who were assassinated, too many. And the silencing that's intended by that, it's our task to undo that. And so when we find these photos, when we find these lost documents, these lost books, and we can amplify their voice, it's not their voice, but it is sort of an important thing to think about. So finding these photos I was very happy to find them. There's a whole series actually of these, and you sort of see how he's dressing, what the styles of the 70s look like. So I've always been very moved by that. Now, I'm going to show you our conference in Binghamton, which was a regional event, and NYASA, the New York African Studies Association, was involved. I know Dr. Edmondson was a member, president of NYASA at one point, and right around that time we were using NYASA and Cornell Africana and other regional organizations to build up our conference. We took 3 years to plan the conference. It was just students, myself as a grad student and undergrads and grad students ran this conference, and we hadn't done anything on that scale, so we were figuring it out as we went. At the very end, the famous professors came in and tried to take it from us. We didn't let them because we were activists, but it was a wrestling match, and so we shared it in the end. It was very interesting. So here's a Binghamton thing I wanted to show you for a couple of reasons. And it's not as clear on this projector as I wanted, but that's okay. So I just want to give you a riff about this, which is everybody knows how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and some Rodney scholars know, Groundings with my brothers. There's a few other books, a few other people know some of them. But his scholarship, I think, is not paid enough attention to. And he was unlike some of the other Pan-African leaders who did great scholarship on the side, he was a scholar, a really, really brilliant scholar. And he wrote scholarship for the people, and he also wrote scholarship for the peer-reviewed journals that didn't want his words in them, and he managed to get them in there. And so the scholarship is really tight, and I think really deserves a lot more attention. This piece that he wrote in Binghamton, I've always had a special affinity for, and I almost never see anyone cite it, so I want to bring it to your attention. It's in the review. It's not the Binghamton Review, which was a horrible right-wing newspaper. There's 150 of those now. And that's actually the breeding grounds for Fox News. There was a whole institute out of DC to try to develop right-wing thought. And they used to always harass us activists and name us and call us things. This is the Bordeaux Review, so the review of the World Systems scholarly network that is around Bordeaux Center. So you can't see it in the fine print there, but he gave this as a lecture at the Bordeaux Center in '78 on one of his visits. And then after he was killed, they decided to print it. So this came out in 1981. And it's simply Plantation Society of Guyana. What he does in here really resonated with me, and I think is provocative by today's standards. I don't know if you can see that. I underline the blue part. So he's telling you, here's the two top progressive historiographers of Guyana. Both Marxist, one overtly Marxist, one ostensibly Marxist. So these aren't colonial thinkers. These are the leading left progressive thinkers. And I'll read it to you. It says, J. Mandel would, I believe, describe himself as a Marxist, but on the crucial question of what the blacks did after the abolition of slavery, his vision, like that of Adamson, is the planter vision. So he just says that and moves on, and nobody's really made note of it. It's a pretty hardcore critique. I don't think most Marxists want to be associated with planter colonial thinking. It resonated for me because my dissertation in Binghamton was on the disjuncture, I ended up calling it the apartheid epistemology of the scholarship of the Swahili coast. Because you have the colonial historiography, and then in the attempt to decolonize that historiography, a lot of the colonial thinking was maintained unintentionally. And then you have a parallel scholarship coming out of the Pan-African world that I trace back to Drusilla Houston and Leo Hansberry and Du Bois. When you had these Pan-African thinkers come to East Africa, they didn't buy the colonial myths about the role of Arabs, about the positionality of the different racial and ethnic groups. They saw right through it because of their own experiences in the diaspora. And so being attentive to that, I found this to be really resonant. And I think this kind of scholarship needs a lot more attention. I brought you some more slides of it. It's not very clear. One of the things he's doing is, just briefly, is saying that the traditional interpretation was the planter's interpretation, and the Marxist bought it lock stock, which was that after slavery ended, the formerly enslaved basically left the plantation and became a peasantry. And he's saying, well, they can't interpret the 1841 strike, general strike, because peasants don't strike, laborers strike. And he's showing you in this carefully argued piece that they're actually a rural proletariat. And that after the strike fails, they become a peasantry as a strategy, and then they go back to being proletarian. And so it's far more complex. And again, this also, I think, intersects with coloniality and decolonial theory, because we're looking at continuums of racialized labor, and they're not just linear. They're a lot more complex. And so one of the questions I've been wrestling with, and we'll circle back to, is this idea that dependency theory comes from Latin America and diffuses to Africa. And the coloniality, when I was in the coloniality studies group at Binghamton that we started, I was a founder of it, I had this provocative idea that coloniality was a useful theory for Africa, and many people, luminaries, Frederick Cooper and others, were saying this was somehow a colonial imposition from outside and it didn't belong. And I'm seeing that actually it might be indigenous. And so the idea with dependency and coloniality, in my opinion, is that it doesn't start in Latin America and diffuse. It's already part of the African diaspora before it comes to Africa. And so it's really just coming home or circling, and it's a lot more complex, the movement of these ideas. So I had a couple slides on that. Now, in the same issue, this is 1981, there's this historical statement. It showed a couple of places, statement on the death of Walter Rodney. And the important point here is it's signed by a lot of the leading scholars at the time. You can see the list there. And then in the second to last paragraph, they call for an international commission of inquiry as to who assassinated Walter Rodney. And with a lot of these assassinations, the resolution and the truth are a real fight to get out. We're still trying to figure out Thomas Sankara. The truth of Lumumba is coming out in layers and waves. In the case of Walter Rodney, I'm going to give you some updates on that, because the development of figuring out the Commission of Inquiry and what happened is really happening right now, some 38 years later. So I'll come back to that. So briefly, this is the conference we did succeed in pulling off. It ended up being a 3-day conference. There were a lot of things about it I'm very proud of when I look back at it. At the time, I had my head down, was organizing this thing. Partway into it, the Rodney family heard about it, and we connected with them, and they came, and we were very excited just to meet them and to have them join us. And that's when I first met Pat and Asha Rodney and a cousin who came in with them. So we called it Engaging Walter Rodney's Legacies. Again, I thought maybe this would be visible. It's not quite big enough, but the details in the program, which really haven't been published, so I wanted to go back maybe and we'll maybe turn this into a book and put this out. But there were a lot of things that happened in the conference. On this first page here, you can see actually at the very bottom is actually Carol Boys Davies and her panel on Claudia Jones, James, and Rodney making these links. And so this is before her work on Claudia Jones had come out. At the top, you can see Wallerstein and Ali Mazrui. Horace Campbell came from Syracuse. It was a very New York event. And then we had a number of people from Cornell throughout the weekend who were with us. I think at the top here, let's see, that's the Carol's panel with Oliver Cambridge, McClendon, Brian Farhead, before he was here. I know Loxley, you were there as well, and I know a number of Cornell people were involved. We actually did a couple of roundtables at NIASA and a couple of roundtables here at the Africana Research Center in the library side of the building, and sort of generated some interest in scholarship. This panel in particular I was really proud of. We had 2 student panels, and we included scholarship at different levels. And we wanted to have activism, students, and famous luminary professors and sort of mix it up in the spirit of Walter Rodney. So I was on a panel there with Noah Wilkins when he was a student, Greg Thomas when he was a student. Asha Rodney was on our panel and presented her own scholarly perspective. Wole Ralph came from Morris Brown. So we did have some nice student representation. And this, we were very proud of too. This is the organizing committee. When you look through the names, it's the top paragraph is the organizers, and it's almost all students, a handful of professors who we included often because they were important and helped us, but the real work was actually done by students. So then I cut way ahead, and I'm not going to show a lot of slides, but I wanted to just tell you that the work we're doing, so here you see Angela Davis, and behind her Pat Rodney, and Asha Rodney on the side, and then there's some family friends, myself, and a couple of students, and this is at Kennesaw where I teach in suburban Atlanta. But our work in the Atlanta community has really, really grown, especially in the years I've been there since '06. And so there's this proliferation of things that have happened organically. So the papers were deposited, then the symposium got started. Amiri Baraka was the first keynote, and we've now had 16 years. People including Ngugi and Paula Giddings and Beverly Guy-Cheftal, and Angela Davis will be our keynote speaker next year. And so it's been an incredible run of really great speakers. A couple of heads of state have come through. Ralph Gonsalves came. So that symposium has been the main thing that we do every year in March, and that you're all invited to, and we can figure out ways to connect. Then, more recently, I started a speaker series, public speaker series. Again, thinking about how Walter Rodney tried to reach the community. It's a community speaker series, and I based it also, we got to know Vincent Harding in the years before he passed away, and his wife actually lived in the suburban neighborhood I live in, and we found out we were neighbors, which was another unexpected coincidence. And Vincent came back to Morehouse and did this incredible class that blew my mind, where each week he had, it was on the civil rights movement, and each week his pedagogy was unreal. Each week he would have a luminary from the civil rights era from the city they were currently working in, and then a young person and a person in the middle generation, so 3 generations. So I remember the week I went to see first was Detroit, and it was Grace Boggs, my first time meeting her. She was 96 or 7, and amazing. And then the young person was Invincible, the hip hop artist, who I had previously worked with on Palestine, and they're dope. And then the person in the middle was sort of a community organizer and leader. I don't remember her name at the moment, but it was just amazing to see that. The other thing I picked up was that it was a 4-credit class at Morehouse, but that all the local schools in Atlanta, you could take that class for credit. But more importantly, it was open to the public. And so he figured out a way to have a public lecture and a class and a Q&A and a discussion and a reading list for his students that was open to the public if they wanted to read it. If they didn't want to, they didn't have to. High school students were rolling up. So it was just like my pedagogy dream. And I sat in several of these, and I was like, what if I took civil rights and substituted Pan-Africa, and took Martin Luther King and substituted Walter Rodney? And I created this Walter Rodney Public Speaker Series. And we've had, this was actually last year at the symposium, just a nice photo I had. This was sort of opportunistic, just what I have on my computer right now. So that's Beverly Eschenthal and Linda Carty from Syracuse down the road here. And we did a panel talking about Black Studies at 50, and we had Akinyele Umoja and Sam Livingston. All the heads of Black Studies in Atlanta came together with some guests like Linda Carty to talk about the meaning of Black Studies at 50, and particularly Rodney and IBW and all those intersections. So we've also, I think, started to develop a scholarship. We're starting to publish and starting to really, I think, hold important conversations around a lot of that. So the other piece in that, just real quick, is that as this all happened, the Walter Rodney Foundation emerged. And so the family is also, so we call it WRS, that's the symposium, WRSS, the speaker series, and WRF, the foundation, just abbreviated. And the foundation is starting to grow, and so we have a web presence, and I invite you all to check us out on Facebook and on Twitter, and that's the way you can participate and connect. It's a very grassroots effort. We have not gotten a really big grant yet. We run these things on very small contributions from local schools. I brought t-shirts with us, which one of our hustles is we're selling t-shirts. Another thing I'm really proud of is behind the scenes being a part of figuring out how to take the books that Walter Rodney had that were quite honestly being pirated by random people. Some of the publishers were ethical. Many of them were doing a good job getting the books out, but not keeping the books and sending royalties to the family. And in many cases, they were just running with the books and selling them for themselves. So these 3 books, and this is actually the first time I've actually held them all 3 together, to be honest. We just got Groundings with my brothers. But these are all with Verso, and they create a theme, and we've got Walter Rodney's image on the side of the spine. It creates sort of like a collective idea. And these are being ethically published. Verso's been really good in slowly working with us to retypeset. So like how Europe hadn't been retypeset. So if you got a new copy from Pambazuka, it had a nice new cover, but the typos from the 1981 edition were still in there. They didn't have the resources to redo it. So it was the first time that it was actually reread, proofread, copy edited, and the font was updated since fonts were invented by Jobs and all that. So I was very happy about that. So getting those books with Verso was a big deal for us. And I mention all that because the model is where the proceeds of the books actually go to the foundation and to the family. And so now for the first time when we buy these books, when we sign them in our classes, it actually is going to, I think, a really good cause. So I'm really happy and proud of that accomplishment as well. So a couple more things in my remaining 15, 20 minutes that I think I have that I want to show you. So let's see. So back to the Commission of Inquiry. Have you all been following this? It hasn't really made a lot of news. I sent a nice press release to Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Haven't heard back. We're going to keep cajoling them until they put it on, but I just don't think much press has been generated outside of Guyana and a little bit in Jamaica. But so after 1981, the demand for a Commission of Inquiry fell on flat ears. Much later, I think in the late 90s, Shaka, Walter Rodney's son, who was at the time probably about 20 years old, went to Guyana and briefly did a protest and a hunger strike and demanded that there be a Commission of Inquiry. And they sort of took up a debate in Parliament, and then eventually that was dismissed and nothing came out of it. And so then much later, the foundation, having come into existence, put out a call for a Commission of Inquiry. And as a result of that, President Ramatar came to Atlanta, met with the family, went to the archive, and decided that he would initiate a Commission of Inquiry. And it led to a 2014 and 2015 Commission of Inquiry that was exactly what was needed, juridically independent, led by Queen's Counsels, which in the Caribbean is the highest level of legal authority, And they started to interview everybody and look for documents and to actually do a proper job. It was incredibly revelatory. I'll give you some of the highlights. But during the process, the party that assassinated Walter Rodney won the election, came to power, and stopped the commission and complained that it was too expensive and not worth it and was a waste of money for Guyana, and shut it down. By the time they shut it down, the findings were already pretty devastating. But they were getting to elected officials currently in power who had their hands in the assassination, and so it was getting very hot for them, so they stopped it at that point. There is definitely a PhD, or many, in this particular commission of inquiry. There's some incredible findings that are in here. The specific circumstances, again, I don't know how widely known this is. Being around all this work in Atlanta and hearing Pat Rodney himself, or Donald Rodney, Walter's brother, and others talk about this on a first-hand basis, I've absorbed quite a bit of it, and it's an amazing story. So the actual circumstances of his death, he is organizing on the ground in 1980. The government is increasingly repressive. They're sending out thugs and the police to beat people during protests. They're marching on the streets. The coordination of movement is difficult. WPA can't even get a phone line. And so they're trying to get walkie-talkies to communicate street movements. And right before Walter Rodney is assassinated, he and a bunch of people are on trial for arson. There's these trumped up charges. A lot of people are starting to get killed in mysterious circumstances. Father Dark, a Catholic priest, is killed. A number of other leading activists in the community are killed or disappeared. So it's getting much, much scarier. Walter is actually, and this is very tragic, you're not allowed to leave the country in the circumstances when you're under trial, so he sneaks out, goes to Zimbabwe for the 1980 independence celebrations, and is asked by Mugabe himself to stay. And he says, I can't stay, I got to go back, but I'll come in a few months and take up a position as a professor. And one wonders what would have happened if he had done that. And you can just picture Walter Rodney and you know, the Wailers, they're all there celebrating. And you know, to me, that great album, The Wailers' History, comes out of that moment. Anyway, he goes back, and all this violence is increasing. Another thing about it that's parallel to King is, you know, William F. Pepper says that King was exploring running for president, which is really interesting to think about, and what would have happened had he done that. And they had this idea of a rainbow coalition way before Jesse Jackson and so on. So there's a trajectory where the Working People's Alliance, and very briefly too, I should explain, in Guyana, the divide and conquer, you know, technique of British colonialism was so successful because it was dividing, and this is what Walter's scholarship was all about, historicizing the historically enslaved African populations, the black populations, and the South Asian indentured servitude populations that are brought in as strikebreakers. And those two populations pitted against each other, and then each having a political party, the PNC and the PPP, that are loggerheads, and basically neither one has a majority, so it's very hard for continuity and governance to change. And he's historicizing that in the piece I showed you in the History of the Guyanese Working People, which was finished when he was killed and was put out by Johns Hopkins Press a year after he died. And then another little known fact is that that was volume 1 of a 3-part series of the history. So he was, I think it was 1895 to about 1920, and then he had another volume to 1950 and another one that was going to go all the way to the present. And the other two, one was finished and one was almost finished. And Pat tells this tragic story of how they were sitting on his desk. And after he was killed, before his body had been identified, the security forces stormed their house and took a lot of stuff, and those books disappeared. So there's another question of, will somebody in a file cabinet someday find unpublished books and essays by Walter Rodney? And it's doubtful, but then surprises do happen. So I also put that out there, because you just never know who will be in a Guyanese archive someday and come across something. So that's the context. And Walter went to pick up a walkie-talkie with his brother Donald, so they could coordinate the protests and make sure people didn't get violently abused during the protests. The person they got it from, Gregory Smith, is the assassin essentially, and he planted a bomb in it. And so when they got to an agreed upon point, they were going to test the walkie-talkie, but the test frequency is what made it blow up, and so it killed him instantly. The story, there's a lot, and if Q&A I can get into, but there's so much evidence. The government actually thought they were going to assassinate him at 5 o'clock that day, and he missed a meeting. He was waiting for somebody, and Pat tells the story that he would not wait if you were late. He was not cool with that, so at 5:01 he bounced. And so that got rescheduled for 8, and so between 5 and 8, they had put out the word that he was dead. And so it really exposes the fact that they planned it and engineered it. And then at 8 o'clock when he was killed, they thought that he would be killed in a particular way, and that he would be so disfigured he wouldn't be able to be identified, but that didn't go as planned. And so a number of things really are indicative of what they did. Donald was injured and escaped and was able to go and get help. And Karen D'Souza, one of the activists at the time, that's the house that he went to, and she's now giving testimony. So the Commission of Inquiry exposes a lot of the conspiracy, all the way up to the highest ranks, and the current heads of state and the current government, many of those officials, some ministers, seem to be pretty exposed in the plot. And so a number of things happen. Gregory Smith has a U.S. connection, which we haven't fully explored, but he seems to have been trained at Fort Benning, which is notorious for the School of the Americas. He seems to have been trained at another fort in the United States. So the U.S. and British role, I think, needs to be explored more. So this is really a Guyanese inquiry that has happened. He's given a passport under a fake name, doesn't even sign the documents, and is secreted out of the country the next day. And all of that came out. The police officials who were involved in that all gave testimony, and those who were alive talked about it. He went to a non-extraditing country right next door, French Suriname, and lived out his life. He scandalously wrote a book purporting to tell the truth of the assassination, which is still on Amazon. I don't recommend doing much with it or buying it or giving it any attention, but it's also a fascinating thing that an assassin wrote a book clouding the assassination. It's very strange. And then he died years later, and his sister continues to defend his name. She tried to give testimony to the commission and fell apart under cross-examination. Patricia Rodney and other friends and family gave riveting testimony. A lot of this is available. The website at the top there, it goes AUCTR, that's the Atlanta University Center.edu/WRCOI / that's Walter Rodney Commission of Inquiry. The whole commission documentation is all there on that library's digital commons page, so you can see everything there, and it's quite a bit of detail. I brought along just sort of some of the things that were found, getting Gregory Smith out of the country. It's devastating. The government has yet to officially receive and accept. They acknowledged the proceedings. Eventually, that took months, but they have not written it into the record in Parliament, and there's a lot of wrangling around that and the current election taking place. Also, quite tragically, I think, Exxon discovered billions of dollars of oil offshore, and so now the government that gets to harness that money may be there forever, because it's an incredible sum of money in the scale of the capitalist enterprise in Guyana. Their recommendations are pretty deep. Let me just maybe tell you this as well. And I want to finish with the 3 books. So this is the end, before the books, and then I'll end. Walter Rodney's death certificate says death by misadventure. And so the family was never paid out the life insurance policy because he killed himself, supposedly. There's some of his former colleagues, after decades of remembering things a certain way, have decided to re-remember that maybe he was a burgeoning guerrilla fighter, and maybe he was amassing arms and weapons and trying to overthrow the government, non-politically, but in a different way. That's not true, but that re-remembering of history is felt to advance the cause of their alliance with the PNC, the government that killed him. And it's still in power now. They've gone in and out of power between the two. So that contesting of historiography, I think, is really key. So the family, the commission, activists, there's a petition on our website, it's pinned on our Twitter account, you can check that out. We want the death certificate updated to say that death by assassination, which the commission completely approves. They've gone through the autopsy records, forensic analysis. There's an awful lot of analysis from layers of investigations. Scotland Yard was involved in the first round. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. So that piece, and then also his employment is listed on there. It says unemployed, but he was a professor, and so they also want that fixed up. Donald Rodney was accused of a crime as well, and so I wanted to show you this. I mean, in the commission, at the end they talk about the ethnic divide and how the truth of this story is central to healing the ethnic divide. I didn't even mention that also Walter Rodney, when he died, was on the radio and writing a children's book series to teach the youth. And so Kofi Bandu out of Africa and Lakshmi out of India were the first two, and he was explaining the black and Indian origins, South Asian Indian origins. He had an indigenous Indian volume that was going to be coming, a Dutch volume, a British volume. He was going to explain all the different populations of Guyana in his children's book, which is pretty intellectual, sort of advanced children, and they're redoing young children. There's a new version coming out. So, but the children's books are amazing too. So this ethnic divide ends up being the end of their commission report. I mean, they talk about a need to actually have, basically the commission exposes the duplicity and corruption of the police and the army in all of this, and what a dictatorship looks like, and how that hasn't changed. So it's a searing indictment of what happens when you have non-independent police. And I think it has resonance throughout the Caribbean and actually at all governments when we think about what is democracy. This document is really pretty intense. After, there's been panels in Atlanta. This was one at Walter's old school. You know, he went to college there as well as was a professor there. So he has 2 sojourns at UW-Imona. And this was a panel that was held with Hilary Beckles, Horace Campbell, Richard Small, who was his friend, childhood friend, lawyer. They went to Russia together, which was very interesting, on a debate trip, which was Walter's one and main trip to Russia before he was writing the Russia book. So I wanted to show you that. So in '82, Donald Rodney is convicted and sentenced to 18 months in prison for surviving the assassination of his brother. But they trumped, this is the state newspaper, the Guyana Chronicle, and this is the article. It's cut off, there's a third panel there. But anyway, of course he contested and disputed that. He actually gave testimony from his hospital bed the next day with the police there. And he's now, and this is happening in January 2019. These are the documents he's just filed. And again, I'm like, why am I the one that's asked to, just me? I'm asked to, share these with North America. So I'm like, me and my grad student and an undergrad are looking at these. How do we put these out on Twitter? What do we do? These are long, complex legal documents. How do people understand what's in here? How do we write a summary of it? But essentially, he's contesting the grounds of the conviction. He's also contesting it's too late to do an appeal, but he's saying the appeal is justified on the grounds that inadmissible information was kept and there was manipulation and fraud in the first trial. So they rewrote documents and signed them with his name, and it's not true, and he's been able to prove all of that. He's been doing research. He's actually been able to go back to Guyana in recent years, and you can imagine the challenge for him and other family members to actually set foot on Guyanese soil, and the risk involved in all of that. So this is his press release, and so this is now an active case that has, I think, great potential. What I'm not showing here also is that Asha Rodney, whose profession is as a lawyer, but not in this area, so she practices in Atlanta and does a lot of this activist work on the side. It's actually a lot for her as a full-time lawyer, me as a full-time professor. A lot of the activism is we're wondering about the sustainability and wondering about building institutional structures that will survive when one or both of us are no longer able to keep up with the pace we set in our 30s as we get older. So, but she is trying to form a collective of legal scholars and looking for a school that might want to take this on, or an institute, to figure out how to bring these cases to broader jurisdictions, the Organization of American States in particular, and quite possibly the Hague, and the ICC. And again, partly because of the specificity and the need to vindicate Walter Rodney, but also for the healing for the nation of Guyana that's involved, and then also because of how important this case is on a global scale. There's a handful of these parallel cases, and not very many of them are going very well, and this is a case that's wide open, and all of us could play a part in it. So I share it with you partly to let you know about it and to invite you to join us in that work. So I'm going to end with some comments about the books. The most exciting one, I think, because the other two are classics that we all know, and we've done work to make them new in various ways, which I'll share. But this book was not well known at all. I think the only scholarly piece on it that was substantive a number of years ago was by Horace Campbell, and he wrote about it from the archives. So it was little known, and it was in the archives. Walter wrote this in about 1970, researched it in 69. He wrote it in Tanzania. It was part of a class that he was teaching on the French and Russian revolutions. The book comes out of the Russian Revolution side of that class. You can imagine how deep that class must have been. Of course, you have Soviet and Chinese officials, in Tanzania at the time, and he's engaging with them, and they forming camps around their houses and trying to, get people involved with them. And you have all the Angolans and all the other people's movements in the frontline states are there in Dar es Salaam. It's quite an amazing moment. The book has a lot to offer, and I'm biased because I was involved in it, obviously, but it's, I think, very exciting. And a couple things I was going to share. I really like to read the first paragraph of his part of it. We wrote a 75-page introduction to it, a long introduction. It is. That's my fault. I asked Robin to. Robin Kelly writes these introductions to these other books that I just love, and I was like, I want one of your serious introductions, man. So that was part of the invitation to the book project. He had his own connection to it because as a grad student, he tells this amazing story. Ed Alpers, his professor, in his first year of grad study, says, hey, can you footnote this book that Walter Rodney wrote that nobody knows about? And so he's sitting in the archives, footnoting that in UCLA in 1981 or 2. And so he had gotten working on the text. But then the papers did not stay in UCLA. Pat took them back, looked for a home for a long time, and then they reemerged at the UC Works Library. So this first paragraph that he writes, and he's thinking about it as a book. So parts of the book are really, really finished in a way, and other parts we had to really sort of imagine what he was going to finish, or we left them unfinished. But he says, in the era, he starts with a Chairman Mao quote on contradiction. Then he says, in the era from the confrontation with colonial rule in the 1950s and 60s through the process of decolonization, African scholars have resolved a number of issues. First, African history and society became a legitimate field of inquiry. Second, they have emphasized the need to counter the racist colonialist orientation that predominated within the little that had been previously written. Third, they have given primacy to interpretations by Africans themselves. A similar and even more determined effort to overturn racist interpretations of history was made by African descendants in the New World, notably in the United States. This work is the basis for the proliferation of Black Studies programs and is responsible for the demand that, as far as Black people are concerned, white people are historically disqualified from interpreting Black folks to Black folks. This is how he starts his book on Russia. Pretty powerful stuff. And it's very resonant with that moment of decolonizing history. We don't know if he would have said, I wrote that, but let me change some of this. It's going to get published now. I think he would have left it as it was. In the next page, he talks about, as an African perspective, he doesn't feel like he needs to defend writing about Russia. The assumption is he's only going to write about Africa, the Caribbean, or the diaspora somewhere. He's like, no, an African perspective on Russia is really important. And I think that's still cutting edge today in ways that it shouldn't be, but is. Right? And so, the European perspectives don't call themselves that. They're just inherently universal, and they write about the whole world whenever they want to. Everywhere else is sort of segmented into these regions. So he's already, I think, brilliantly challenging that. A couple quick notes on the book that I think are really key and deserve attention. And I brought these notes along for you. One is, in the era of Trump, in the era of real active potential and maybe burgeoning fascism in the United States, he writes about fascism, and it's unexpected to see that in the text. And partly what he's arguing is that the association of Hitler and Stalin is a bourgeois process to delegitimize the Russian Revolution, and it takes Hitler out of the capitalist tradition he comes from. And we've just seen some Republicans calling Hitler a socialist, and they really wanted to be socialist and not capitalist, but he's really capitalist. So Walter's saying that, in a very deep way, that capitalism and fascism are inherently connected. And fascism is what happens when capitalism is in crisis. And so there's, I think, some important pieces there. The original title for the book, and we had a bit of a wrestling match. I'm happy with the title. I think it makes sense, and Verso wanted to have a broad appeal. So the Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World is what we ended up on. Walter's choice, and I argued that we should stick with that, and I lost that, and that's fine, because there was a lot of back and forth, right? But the original title was Two World Views of the Russian Revolution, A View from Africa. And the two worldviews concept, so then part of it was one of the reasons the introduction got longer, is I felt if we're not going to keep the title, we need to explain the importance of the title. The two worldviews concept that he had in mind was that he basically shows that all of the writing on the Russian Revolution was profoundly bourgeois, and so again, it wasn't universal, it wasn't just European and true and academic and dispassionate, it was very grounded in a particular perspective. And so by bracketing all of that as a bourgeois perspective, and then saying the other worldview is the Soviet perspective, and then he looks at both of them very critically and finds that the bourgeois perspective is not looking at the numbers. They're driven by ideology, and when the numbers they say socialist growth cannot happen at this rate, it can't keep up with capitalism, and that's not true. The Soviet numbers he finds are accurate, and that they're not really exaggerated. It's actually pretty scholarly. There's a few places where he disagrees, and he basically shows you these two views. And then the implication, of course, is the third view, which is the third world view. And as Vijay Prashad writes in his preface, and we write in the introduction, this is the moment of the non-aligned movement, when the non-aligned movement was ascendant and could easily have won, particularly if a series of assassinations and repressions hadn't taken place in the way that we now know they did in the late 70s and throughout the 80s. And so the optimism that he had that a third view could come out was not misplaced at that time in history. Now we look back on it and we can see that that's not what happened. So I think that's actually very important, and I think it prefigures, I argue in the introduction, it prefigures Edward Said in a really important way. When we talk about the relationship between knowledge and power, when we talk about the relationship between, from that quote I just read you, subjectivity and epistemology, there's a lot going on at a theoretical level in the 60s and the 70s, in Walter's work, but in the whole Pan-African approach to theory that doesn't get enough attention and gets bifurcated out of the academy as activism. And then pure theory is attributed to Foucault and to Said. And as a scholar of Palestine, I even argue with I love Orientalism. I think it's largely entirely accurate. It's a brilliant book. But we don't look at the book he wrote that same year, got published the next year, The Question of Palestine, which is a searing indictment of colonial historiography. And so how we consume these scholars, I think, is important. When I first got to Binghamton, I had read Fanon as a revolutionary before I thought I'd be an academic. And I'd read Wretched of the Earth, and I looked at, Black Skin, White Masks, and when I got to the academy, it was all black, white skin, Black Skin, White Masks, and Homi Bhabha. And I was, you don't know who Homi Bhabha is? So I read Homi Bhabha that weekend. I was like, it's cool. This stuff, and I got into it. But I was like, he's not better than Fanon, and why aren't you reading Wretched? And so, why are we into certain Fanon, some Césaire more recently? C.L.R. James has this arc where we start to take him seriously in some of his work, not Walter Rodney. Because of your work, Claudia Jones is now, I think, on the map, and people are starting to think about her. How do we select who the intellectuals and the activist intellectuals are that we give credence as creating genealogies of knowledge? And so I learned about the concept of genealogies of knowledge in those classes in Binghamton, and I think it's really important still. What's the relationship between Pan-Africanism and coloniality is a really important question that I've been thinking about since Binghamton. Generally, coloniality is seen as theory, more recently decolonial theory, and Pan-Africanism is seen as social movements and activism, and not as theory. And I argued for a long time, I know I'm not the only one, but I don't think it's that popular yet, that Pan-Africanism is, I think, one of the most profound sources of theory. So if we accept Pan-Africanism as theory, and we think of coloniality, what's the relationship? And in Binghamton, when we did that conference on Walter Rodney, we were really excited to have Sylvia Wynter be one of our keynotes, along with George Lanham. And she was also the keynote at the other group that some of us were involved in, the Coloniality Research Working Group. And she was somebody who was able to function in both of those spaces. And a few of us students were thinking this is a model we want to look at. And I mentioned earlier how Walter Rodney is also a South American, not just the Caribbean. How do we understand Guyana? And I didn't know until a few years ago that he spoke Spanish and that he learned it from his father, who learned Spanish to trade in neighboring countries and was part of the Spanish-speaking world himself. And then knowing Spanish, was able to pick up Portuguese. And Pat tells these crazy stories about going to Portugal to the archives, and there's security officials following him around. When he's in grad school, he's already being surveilled by probably the British, but also the Portuguese security states, because they're like, why is this guy from Guyana in the archives? Just the act of being in the archives gets this guy surveilled. Just the act of grounding with Rastas in Jamaica gets him expelled and leads to the Rodney rebellion or riots. His work with students got him in trouble with the party in Tanzania. So it's amazing just the kind of work he did kept getting him in trouble. So I think Sylvia Wynter's work is an interesting place for us to think about that. What are the relationships between those two schools and threads of knowledge? And I think Walter Rodney is an important pivot point in relation to that. I think there's a ton of other Rodney scholarship that deserves more attention. One of the things I'm working on with Asha Rodney now is we have a journal that we had a newsletter called Groundings, and now we're turning it into a peer-reviewed journal, and our first issue will be coming out shortly. And I invite you all to take up that space as a peer-reviewed space for your scholarship. One of the issues I envisioned, for example, is on his essay from 1969, the significance of the African origins, the Guinea origins of Africans enslaved in the New World. And it's a really groundbreaking piece on the fact that African cultural specificity shaped the presence and resistance, marronage and uprisings of Africans in the Americas, from Mexico to Peru and so on. And so that specificity, for me, I have to jump to Manila Hall or someone else later to get that kind of discourse, and he's not attributed with having made that contribution. So I think we'll do a special issue just looking at what the significance of that essay was. There's a bunch of essays that are at that level, I think, that deserve greater attention, and so we'll do some of that work. So those are my comments on that book. And then How Europe, the only real major comment is that we got a really beautiful introduction by Angela Davis, and the typesetting and the index is expanded, and so it's just a better living edition. And the cover. We did not like their first cover. It had a very problematic, they were like, how do you like this? And we were like, it's a negotiation. They've been cool with us. They're like, we need more of this content. We need to be more diverse in our Marxist perspectives and so on. It was scorched earth, sort of dry earth, and I was like, that's a desertification myth. I don't really think that belongs on the cover of this book. And I'm quite happy with this cover, with the colonialism, the slave ship, and the resistance in the Zulu areas, and it came out quite beautiful. And then this is the one that it's coming out in 2 weeks, so I'm so excited about it. We're really excited that we got your professor, Dr. Davies, to write the introduction to this, and it's a very important introduction. And that's the table of contents from the Russia book. Asha and I ended up being editors of this book. It wasn't even our plan, but when we first went to Verso said, of these books, we think this one is so short, Groundings and My Brothers, it should be a chapter in a Walter Rodney reader. And we said we want to do a Walter Rodney reader, we want to do it right, we want to convene an international advisory board and decide what texts are going to be in there, we'll take our time on it, but we think this needs to be a standalone book. And we prevailed on them, and they said, well, we need extra content, it's too short to have it be a book. And so we proposed reflective essays, and some of the people we wanted to do reflective essays, like Bobby Hill, were unable to do it for personal reasons and other things, and we went through our list, and we ended up with, I think, an incredible collection. Patricia Rodney writes about living the Groundings and what it was like raising a family and being in the midst of that work that Walter was doing, and so her essay, I think, is very significant. The Conscious Youth by Robin Bongo Jerry Small, I mentioned earlier, he was about 19 or 20 when Walter got there, and him and Joff Frank was 17. They took Walter around to the most oppressed communities, places that outsiders were not normally welcome, and Walter grounded with people, learned the term grounding from the Rastas, and so his perspective is amazing. One of the most electrifying things in there, and as the editor, it was mind-blowing when I got the draft and I was reading it over. He describes how the night that they learned that Walter was not going to be allowed back in, and they had some inkling that might be coming, they massed in town, and then they went up to the school, up to Mona, and the students were massing, so they convened these two separate populations and had a mass mobilization to decide what to do, and that's what led to the protest the next day. Students protested in their gowns, which was very symbolic, I think. We've heard a story that they started commandeering buses and transporting people around, and there's a story which has gone from probably not true, it's apocryphal, to now we think, based on eyewitnesses, it is true, that Peter Tosh was driving one of the buses and crashed, and they all ran, and so they're collecting these stories. So in this moment, apparently while they're in the building, that's when the TV was on, and the 1968 Olympics were happening, and Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised the fist, and that act of resistance added fuel to the fire of what they were doing, and really I think the idea that those happen on the same nights, and that they all watched that, and they were all seeing it, and he reported on that, and others now also said that, I remember that happening at the same moment. I had never linked those two. I don't know if they'd ever been linked before. So that's one of the things that comes out of the book. David Austin talks about what's happening in Montreal. And I'll mention too, when he was there with us, just a few days ago in Atlanta, he's pulling out photos from Joan Jones. I love her name. And it was very memorable when he mentioned her. I thought to myself, that's a name I need to remember. She was one of the main activists behind making that Black Writers Congress happen. And then a few days ago, we got word that she passed away. He described her as fighting an illness and so on. And she was a black leader in Halifax and had come into Montreal. So all that sort of black history and black radicalism and Canadian history comes out from his talk. She was the one who had the camera and took these incredible photos. So he showed us photos that nobody had ever seen. Photos of Walter and Joan Jones, photos of Walter and Stokely and Miriam Makeba. And Pat told the story again of how Stokely and Miriam Makeba met at our house. They'd been invited over for a political rally, and they fell in love on the spot. And after that, we could tell they were going to be together. So again, the interesting stories that come out. And then Marie Shepard has a very important essay that at one time, when we self-published this volume out of Atlanta, was the afterword to the book. It's an extended version, and she's added some content to it. And Randall Robinson's piece, I was really, kind of bowled over as a young person. Trans-Africa and the anti-apartheid struggle was one of the things that framed my life in the 80s. And the fact that he participated was amazing. His essay, sort of like, I got to compare it to Angela Davis in a way. These two essays, what they have in common is this genius level of simplicity, and you're reading it and it's just the simplest thing you've ever read and simultaneously the deepest thing. It's like a profound meditation. His meditation gets into what it means to be one's brother's keeper, and it's sort of biblical, it's sort of Maslowian in terms of the hierarchy of human needs, and it's very profound, and I think it ties in with some of the cutting edge stuff I've seen in psychology and addiction work, and the need for human beings to be nourished by the love of other human beings, their parents and their community, and what happens under capitalism when that's missing and how it fractures and breaks us. And so Walter's love of his fellow human beings was part of that anti-capitalist impetus. And so the way he puts it, I think, is incredibly moving, and I'm really proud to have that in the book as well. So I'm really excited to share with you. This is the first public launch, really, of this book. So it's very exciting to have this opportunity at Cornell to share it with you. Share it with you, Carol, as one of my mentors in Binghamton. And just be back here at the Africana Center to share all of this work. So I'm going to wrap it there, and if you have any questions or if I can elaborate on anything, I look forward to that. And then also, I'm interested in building. I did bring shirts because we sell those to raise money for the foundation, and the books also, the proceeds go there. So I feel like I'm still in my 20s hustling, merge with me, but that's what the plan with that is. And yeah, just a real pleasure to share this with you all. Thank you so much.